So great. I think we are ready to get started. Good afternoon. I'm Desti Homan-Sprague with the Maine Women's Lobby, and I'm thrilled to have Courtney Allen from MRAP here. Courtney, do you want to introduce yourself and share a little bit about MRAP?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Destiny, and the Maine Women's Lobby for having us today. My name is Courtney Allen. I am the Policy Director for the Maine Recovery Advocacy Project. We call it MRAP for short. I also serve on my local city councilor as a at-large city councilor for the city of Augusta. And today we are talking about a bill that the Maine Recovery Advocacy Project is one of our priority bills. Very simply, MRAP is a grassroots network of people across the state of Maine working to redefine and reimagine justice, access, connection, and recovery in the state of Maine. We are people in recovery, people who use drugs, our family members, and all of our allies in every form. And so this is one of our priority bills.
Great. And I know we were hoping that the bill sponsor, Senator Maxman, could join us, but it seems she might be hung up in committee. Is that right?
Yes, Senator Maxman sends her apologies, but she is currently in committee working on a CMP bill that is very important. And so she really wanted to be here, but is going to stay in committee to work on that bill.
Sure. So tell us a bit about what the bill is and does. Like what problem is what is the bill seeking to do and what problem is it solving?
Yeah, so the bill is LD 488. It's a resolve to expand recovery community organizations throughout Maine. And that's very, that language is picked very specifically, and that's because I want to tell you about what a recovery community organization is. So a recovery community organization is an independent nonprofit organization run by and for people in recovery. They do three really particular things: access to recovery support services like recovery coaches, telephone recovery support, like calling people who are in or seeking recovery from substance use disorder, as well as advocacy work. And one of the ways that they do that is through a recovery community center. And so a recovery community center is a space in the community for the recovery community, right? And so one of the really, really simple ways that I like to explain a recovery community center is that the recovery community is a family, and the centers are our homes, right? And so right now across the state of Maine, there are 13 recovery community centers who are doing amazing work in many of our counties. And last year, they helped to combat the substance use disorder crisis and the overdose crisis through those key three services. And in 2020, they provided 6,837 activities that supported over 55,000 people in recovery. They also had 432 recoverees that have been paired with recovery coaches. Recovery coaches are people with lived experience in recovery who help to access services and to be with people in their process of recovery from substance use disorder. They also provided those telephone recovery services. 634 individuals received those supports through 2020 and increased membership greatly. And I like to tell you about what they've been doing in 2020 in particular because of the pandemic that was happening, right? And so recovery community centers are on the front lines of this pandemic around substance use. And what we saw happen in 2020 is, for many of us, all of us, in or out of recovery, was this really increased isolation, right? But for people in recovery, this is really detrimental because our whole culture and our whole way of life is based in connection and community. And so they were on the front lines. This bill in particular helps to ensure that everybody, every community, every county in the state of Maine has access to those important spaces for the recovery community to come home to. So there's 7 counties that don't have a recovery community center, including Franklin, Hancock, Kennebec, Piscataquis, Somerset, Waldo, and York counties. And so this bill would provide funding to open recovery community centers in all of those counties.
That's such a great sort of background and information about how that all works. I really appreciate that. So this bill is trying to get sort of equity and access geographically. Is that a fair way to describe it?
Yeah, that's absolutely a fair way to describe it. We believe that all Mainers deserve access to these wonderful services in their communities.
How are the current existing centers are they funded generally?
Yeah, so the network began 2 sessions ago where the legislature funded 9 recovery community centers across the state in the Maine Recovery Hub, which is based out of Portland. And they support those centers. Other centers are coming online, or the barn has been in existence for many years prior to any state funding supporting them. And they're getting grants from the state through the substance use disorder block grants and other forms. And then there's also one center in Rockland that we just learned about that is not receiving any funding. It's very grassroots, people in recovery trying to take care of their community members, because that's what we do in the recovery community. We're a very, very resilient community that comes together to take care of each other.
So this is really the next step, that in some cases there are grassroots recovery centers, like the barn or like in Rockland, that, sort of have gotten themselves up and going and organized, and then the state just began funding these services 2 years ago. And so this is sort of closing the circle and, continuing to roll out this service infrastructure through state funding.
Yep, and we also, like, the Governor Mills very much supports recovery community centers across the state. And inside of her opiate response strategic plan, she calls for more funding for recovery community centers in new communities. And so we see this bill as helping her get to meet her goal sooner than expected.
Great. So, so it's basically a straight funding bill. I mean, really, like, the service infrastructure already exists. Presumably there's some kind of like parameters around like what the centers should look like or do, or goals that they're working for to create some consistency. Does this bill change any of that? Or is it just seeking to sort of expand access?
Yeah, no, this bill doesn't change any of the infrastructure. We have the infrastructure ready. There are communities across the state ready to get to work. And it would just ensure that we are able to build out that structure farther to every county that doesn't have one yet. And I want to go back to this idea of there are some grassroots centers that are doing their best work without any funding in Rockland. And then we have some centers, we have a new center coming on in Lewiston that's receiving very small amounts of money to do really important work. And it's not enough. It's just enough to like keep the lights on and the doors open. But with this spike in overdoses, we saw 502 people die last year from accidental overdoses. That's the highest number we've ever seen in the state of Maine. And the early data from January and February is calling for even higher numbers for 2021. And that, again, is really grounded in this idea that in 2020, the recovery community got disconnected, right? Like we aren't able to access our meetings in the same way. I will say, like, we responded immediately, and meeting spaces are usually very much in person. And instead we responded and went online, but it's not the same, right? Like, it's just not the same. And as we like move into the next phase of the pandemic, where we're getting vaccines, we're starting to come out, able to connect again, we're going to need these spaces as the recovery community to come back together. and to heal and to find space to be together, right? And we believe as the recovery community that we're one of the most important key aspects of lowering the overdose crisis. We've been doing this a long time, taking care of our community members a long time, and these will be the spaces that we can come home to and be together. You know, somebody said to me the other day that these spaces, it's not just like you get services there. You go there on a rainy day and you have a cup of coffee with your community members and you hit a meeting together, and maybe you heard from Bob, made that name up, that there was a job, you know, down at the local coffee shop, and then Susan knows about the owner and they get you connected with that job, right? So it's very grassroots, community-based ways that, you know, treatment providers are doing great work, but the recovery community needs to be at the table, because we can get people to stop using drugs, right? Like that can happen, but there's a very big difference between not using drugs and entering long-term recovery. And what you need to do to enter that long stage recovery is to increase recovery capital. And so what recovery capital is internal and external resources that somebody can initiate and sustain long-term recovery. So things like housing, transportation, community-based services, but also like internal sense of self. And the elders in our community are the ones that can teach that to people right in these recovery community centers.
I love how you describe that. I think it's really inspiring and exciting. I always want to check in with folks during these conversations about the intersection with gender equity, or, you know, gender oppression, or just to think about that connection, because we are an organization that works on issues of like disproportionate impact across gender. And I wonder how you think about that, Courtney. I think we've probably had this conversation at some point before, but I'd love to just check in about that.
Yeah, in the context of recovery community organizations and centers, the way that it intersects with gender and women and motherhood in particular is that a lot of the spaces, when somebody is entering recovery or trying to sustain their recovery, a lot of the spaces that we have, like for meetings or pro-social events, aren't exactly kid-friendly. And so people can't, you know, hit a meeting on a Friday night at 7 o'clock because they need to be home with their kiddos making dinner, right? And the recovery community centers across the state have a childcare room, or a room where you could bring your kiddo and we all take turns, you know, watching the room, and so that mom or parent can be in their space. So it, like, these recovery community centers can break down those barriers where moms can't get the social support that they need to sustain recovery, through like having these spaces to watch the kids and, you know, make dinner for them and be together. And then I think the other part is around the increase in women that we're seeing in the prisons, this extravagant increase in how many women are being incarcerated and how many women are losing access to their children, and having these spaces to come home to when they get out of incarceration.
That's what one of the things that comes up for me is, you know, a huge increase in women being incarcerated, and that's overwhelmingly connected with both prior experience of trauma and then substance use or possession or whatever. And the community is such a powerful way to address both of those issues. That raises one of the question that we got over in the Facebook chat when we think about the intersection with criminalizing drugs, or, you know, some of the other bills that might be before us this session. We did have a conversation about decriminalizing drugs during Bill Bites a couple of weeks ago. And I wonder if MRAP takes a position on that, or how, you know, if there's a way that the recovery community is thinking about decriminalization of substances in their work?
Yes, so we do take a position on that. The bill that we're talking about right now is LD 967, and it would restructure drug sentencing laws to focus on access to a health assessment or to paying a fine. And the reason why that we support this bill is because we know that substance use disorder is a disease, right? And so when somebody it would make it so that possession is a civil offense. And the reason for that is when substance use disorder, if we know that substance use disorder is a disease, the criteria inside of that disease in the DSM-5 requires that somebody uses a substance. In the state of Maine, possessing a substance is a crime. And so we see that as not making sense, right? Is substance use disorder a disease or is it a crime? And we believe it's a disease and that folks need access to treatment, housing, education, recovery support services, and not access to incarceration, because it does the exact opposite of what we know somebody needs to enter and sustain recovery: connection, right? Recovery is built on 4 pillars: health, home, purpose, and community, and that's from SAMHSA. And health is the access to the services they need to remain healthy. Home is a safe and stable place to live. Purpose is a reason to get up in the morning. And community is safe and supportive relationships. None of those things happen while somebody is incarcerated. And under no circumstance should we be incarcerating folks for possession of substances, as it is a criteria of the symptom of the disease that, you know, we have been saying for so long that we can't arrest our way out of the opiate crisis. And yet we continue to try to do it, right? We keep saying it, and yet we do it again. And, you know, like in 2018, we arrested over 1,600 people for simple possession of drug use when they should have been offered access to treatment and a health assessment. Drug arrests in Maine have continued to decrease over the last decade and accounted for almost 9% of all the arrests in Maine. In 2018, arrests for drug trafficking made up over half of all of the Class A arrests and over a quarter of Class B arrests. Drug arrests of women have increased 25% between 2008 and 2018, with arrests of Class A offenses more than tripling during that period. And in 2019, nearly half of all the sentences for felony drug offenses resulted in a sentence to prison. People don't get better in prison. People get better in community and with their recovery community and access to treatment. We should never be arresting people for simple possession of substances.
Powerful. And I agree. When we think about LD 488, and also just a reminder for the folks who are watching on the stream or here with us in the Zoom room, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat or to raise your hand. But in terms of LD 488, so this bill to fund the sort of the continued access for recovery centers in Maine, what do you see as the sort of opportunities or potential challenges in front of the bill?
Yeah, so I think that the opportunities is that we know that recovery community organizations work as a response to substance use disorder and to helping people get into and sustain long-term recovery. It is a funding bill, right? It is a funding bill. And so we know that a lot of people are saying, and I agree, we are in a budget crisis, but I don't think that allows us to say that we can't respond to substance use disorder, right? We're spending $18 million on the youth detention center. We budgeted almost $500,000 on the criminal justice system. And so this is a small drop in the bucket compared to what we're spending in places that don't work, and in comparison to the lives that it will save in the long run, right? So we have to get these numbers, flatten these curves of overdoses that are happening in this community. And that's going to take a system-wide response from every level of government, from the federal government to the governor's office to our local city councils. And I see this as just a drop in the bucket compared to what we would gain from these spaces being available in every county in Maine.
Are there other, thinking of that system-wide response, are there other sort of sister bills or proposals that feel like they're really a match with this one that you want to be on people's radar?
Well, I see that Representative Warren is in the room, and I wonder if she is available to answer that question, because one of the bills that I would say is a match is one of her bills.
Surprise!
I know, I'm sitting here wolfing my lunch.
Sorry, Representative Warren.
No, not at all. Hi, Courtney, you're amazing. I'm cheering you on. Ask me the question again, I missed it.
We were talking about, if there are other bills, because we know that recovery centers are one part of a system-wide change. Is there another bill or two that you want to highlight that feel like a partner with this proposal as well?
I think that Courtney just talked about the bill that would decrim simple possession or restructure drug sentencing. And that's a huge piece. And the piece that she's here to talk about, providing funding for recovery. But also, I think in general, funding for crisis response, as opposed to funding for the police to do crisis response, would get us a long way to the place that we all want to go. So what we know right now in Maine is that everybody's told, if there's a problem, call 911, right? So your cat's in a tree, your house, whatever's happening, you call 911. Well, the problem is, when you call 911, 3 places and only 3 places can be dispatched: the police, fire, or rescue. And what we're trying to do is add a 4th place, which is a crisis response. And that crisis might look like substance use disorder, and that crisis might look like a mental health issue. But in either of those 2 cases, fire, rescue, and police aren't the right response. It's a crisis person. Somebody who can actually maybe sit down on the sidewalk with you and talk about what's going on with you that day and what you might need. And so that's the other piece that I would add. There are a bunch of bills coming. There are a bunch of bills already out. And they'll be handled in Health and Human Services. I would give you the number of my bill, which you guys know I worked on last session. I'm working on again this year, but it doesn't have a number yet. So thank you for the opportunity. And Courtney, you're rocking it as always.
Thanks, Representative Warren, for jumping on.
Appreciate you being willing to do that and to lift those up. So a question, sort of a logistical question about the next steps for this bill. So it's a funding bill. The legislature just passed a new biennial budget like 36 hours ago. So let's talk a little bit about what that means for this bill. And I'm happy to let you to jump in or to share my perspective on that.
I'll let you take that, Dusty.
All right. And of course, if there are other folks who have feedback on that, I welcome it, because I think this is pretty confusing for a lot of people. As I understand it, the legislature passed a biennial budget, so that's the 2-year regular budget, on Tuesday. That budget will become law in time for the new state fiscal year to begin on July 1st, so 90 days after the budget is passed and the legislature technically adjourns. However, the committees are going to continue their work And a lot of that continued committee work is going to inevitably include funding bills like this bill, like paid family and medical leave, like a range of other things that we care about. Later in the spring, when the rules and regulations about federal stimulus money are written and available, they're not currently available, and when we have the policies and budget proposals from the rest of this legislature together, the legislature can put all of that information together and develop a more comprehensive understanding of what they want the budget to look like moving forward. And we hope that it includes LD 488, the funding for these recovery centers. At that point, they can pass a supplemental budget. So that's what's, a supplemental budget is essentially a budget amendment. They can choose to pass that, that supplemental or that amendment with a 2/3 vote, in which case it becomes law immediately, or they can continue with the path they've currently chosen, which is to pass it with a majority vote, so a 50% plus one, and then it will become law 90 days later after adjournment. But what the way they've managed the budget this year is to make sure that they can at least keep the lights on for July 1st and buy more time to get a more comprehensive understanding of the budget later in the spring. So if you have your eye on budget work, either for this bill or for any of the other bills that we've been talking about, not to worry, there still is an opportunity for those funding pieces to move forward, and we expect that they will, especially because of the federal stimulus money. But I think we just don't know enough about it right now to be able to make those decisions. So I talked a lot, but hopefully that was helpful, and hopefully it was accurate. And so yes, to be very clear for questions in the chat, we expect that there will be a number of other funding bills taken up and passed later in the spring, and that the current existing new biennial budget will be amended to include those. So go ahead, Courtney.
I just wanted to tell everybody that we do have a hearing date on this bill. It is April 12th at 1 p.m. In the Health and Human Services Committee. And we would invite everybody who is willing and available to come and testify on this bill. And I think Elena has a little talking point document that if you want to know more about the bill, it's www.teenyurl.com/expanding RCCS4me.com. Elena will drop it in the chat for us. Everything that you need to know is available there, and we would really appreciate your support.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was really helpful, Courtney. I learned a lot, and I hope other folks did too. And I think we've put the link to MeRAP in the chat as well, and also over on the Facebook. So I thank you, and I'm glad that we were able to do this today. Thanks to everybody who was in the room with us, and I hope to see you next week with Senator Vitelli talking about the Earned Income Tax Credit for Maine. So have a great day. Thanks, Courtney. Appreciate your time.